The story of our country is the story of a long struggle to make the promise of democracy real. There has always been a deep contradiction between the promise of democracy and the challenge of inequality in the United States. Our nation was formed based on a hopeful new dream, that we are all created equal and that we are all endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that promise did not reach us all. Native lands were taken to found this new nation, and slavery was codified in our Constitution, while the right to vote, the most basic right in our democracy, was at first restricted to white men who owned property. But the dream for democracy lived on, and for hundreds of years we have worked to realize its promise, from the long struggle to abolish slavery, to the fight to expand the right to vote to the poor, to people of color, and to women. And we, the 99%, have won, time and time again. And every time we won, the 1% tried to push back, and so our struggle continued. Let's walk through that history to see how we got to the crisis that we're in today. It was the labor of the 99%, of slaves, poor farmers, and immigrant workers, that built this nation. While plantation slavery was driving the Southern economy, industrialists in the North built the first factories in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. The European immigrants who came to this country in search of opportunity labored for long hours under harsh conditions in those factories. Those mills were powered by coal, which poisoned both the factory workers and the white and black coal miners in Appalachia, and laid the early foundation for global climate change we are facing today. At the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. economy grew faster than any other in the world, leading to unprecedented profits for the 1%, and propelling our new country to a position of world leadership. As the economy grew, a wave of reformers sought to deepen our democracy. They were people like us, African American activists fighting to abolish slavery, mine workers organizing for a living wage, immigrant workers fighting for an 8-hour day, mothers organizing to end child labor, women fighting for the right to vote, anti-imperialists fighting military intervention, and farmers fighting for economic justice. And we started to win. But while the 99% organized, corporate interests in the 1% organized too. Industrialists and mine owners used force and ethnic division to beat back movements of workers and poor farmers. Wealthy business leaders and bankers were investing heavily in the stock market, borrowing money just to buy more stocks. And while they grew wealthier, the poor just got poorer. As economic inequality increased, so did the instability of the market. Through their greed, wealthy bankers drove the economy off a cliff, and in 1929, the stock market crashed. 1 out of every 4 workers in the U.S. couldn't find work anywhere, leading to the Great Depression. Americans responded by organizing movements of the unemployed and workers' movements, like the mass strikes of immigrant garment workers in New York City, and the auto workers' sit-down strike at the General Motors factory in Flint, Michigan in 1936. These struggles inspired workers all over the United States and helped launch the modern labor movement. These progressive movements helped to elect a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1932. He was actually elected as a conservative business Democrat, but popular movements pushed him to turn the power of the government to work directly for the American people. With the New Deal, he set up the Works Progress Administration to employ 2 million people directly. He signed the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations Act to expand workers' rights to organize for better wages and working conditions. President Roosevelt also signed the Glass-Steagall Act, which protected American consumers from the vagaries of the market by separating commercial banks, like those that offered mortgages and savings accounts, from investment banks that gambled on the market. Through these programs, unemployment steadily declined while market stability increased. Through years of struggle, the 99% organized and took action, and the 99% won. Those policies led to a long period of rising incomes and greater equality for many Americans, the classic American dream. But the American dream remained out of reach for many people in this country. Racism and sexism continued to shape the economic and political structure of the United States. Many workers, including farm workers and domestic workers, most of whom were African Americans, Mexican immigrants, and women at the time, were excluded from labor rights and protections. Legalized segregation and discrimination meant that African American people had separate schools and restrooms, and they were barred from decent employment. That started to change in the 1950s and 60s, when thousands of civil rights activists challenged the shameful exclusion of African Americans from our country's democratic promise. Hundreds of civil rights organizers participated in nonviolent direct actions, like the lunch counter sit-ins and the freedom rides to desegregate buses, often facing forms of violence. They won an end to legal segregation and a radical expansion of the right to vote. They acted with amazing courage and dignity and showed us all that nonviolence has the potential to open up both our democracy and our economy. At the same time, we had no safeguards in place to protect our communities from industrial pollution. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, exposed the chemical companies for poisoning the air we breathe and the water we drink, and it motivated thousands of people to organize and win the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. Many other movements also emerged in this moment. The movement among Mexican and Filipino farm workers, Native American movements for justice and sovereignty, student movements against the Vietnam War, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement. All across the country, we stood up for ourselves, our families, and our communities. As millions of African Americans and other newly empowered American citizens joined the electorate for the first time, they helped elect leaders who would pass legislation to improve economic security for all of us. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Congress passed Medicare and Medicaid, as well as aid to education. These powerful waves of movements in the 20th century made real headway in challenging economic inequality and the limits on democracy that had always plagued our country, bringing many of us real economic security and giving us hope for a more democratic future. So how did we end up where we are today? How did we go from shared prosperity to an economy of, by, and for the 1%? It was because, in the 1970s, the corporate interests in the 1% started getting organized. They developed a three-part strategy to roll back the gains we fought so hard for. 1. Attack workers. 2. Take control of our democracy. And 3. Divide and conquer. The 1% went after unions. Collective bargaining has historically meant better wages for union members and raised wages for workers in general. So by weakening unions and driving down union density, corporate employers could depress wages even as production was growing. For the last 30 years, corporate interests have systematically organized to roll back our rights to organize in the workplace, as we saw in 1981, when Reagan fired striking air traffic controllers, and during last year's attacks on collective bargaining in Wisconsin and Ohio. But that's not all. Many employers have shifted more and more of their responsibility for economic security, including healthcare and retirement costs, onto us to increase their own profits, pushing many of us into bankruptcy and debt. In addition, job growth in recent decades has been concentrated in the service sector, like the restaurant industry and domestic work. Many of these jobs pay less and have fewer benefits than jobs in industries where unions have been able to make real headway in the past. Most of the workers in these industries are women, African Americans, and immigrants. Exploiting immigrant labor has become crucial to the 1% strategy to make profit. But the war on workers goes further than that. In the last 40 years, the 1% went global. To get out of having to pay the decent wages and benefits that workers had fought so hard for, employers closed down many of the factories in the United States, and they opened up new factories in other nations around the world, especially in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia, where they could exploit workers more easily. This hurt workers in the United States and workers in other nations. The second part of the 1% strategy was to take over our democracy. It started when we entered a state of permanent war. Defense contractors and oil companies need war to protect their interests, and U.S. military power helps to support and protect corporate interests around the world. As a result, nearly 60% of federal discretionary spending still goes to the Pentagon and its contractors. That budget has doubled in the last 10 years, while states and cities around the country are suffering extreme budget shortfalls cutting teachers, community programs, and services. The 1% is trying to starve the government of tax revenue. While they've shifted the focus of public spending to war and defense, we've heard corporate interests crying out for tax relief for the last 40 years. As a result, while the tax rates of the 99% have remained stable, the tax rates of the 1% have dropped dramatically. This has pushed us further into debt, while their personal and corporate profits skyrocket. In the past 40 years, a few in the 1% have systematically attacked the government programs that benefit the 99%, from Social Security and Medicare to nutrition assistance and Pell Grants for college students. They also went after all of the financial regulations that were put in place after the Great Depression to stop big banks and big corporations from making profits at the expense of social stability. Financial deregulation meant that banks could make dangerous decisions in the interests of making a quick profit, like the mortgage disaster that devastated millions of homeowners. The 1% went after environmental protections. They are attempting to destroy environmental protection laws that keep them from extracting the most profit from the environment at the expense of people and our planet. They are pursuing increasingly extreme forms of energy, such as Canadian tar sands, mountaintop removal coal mining, and hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, for natural gas. Fossil fuels concentrate carbon in our atmosphere to the point where we are now feeling the effects of climate change, manifesting in disasters like Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill that destroyed local Gulf economies. The 1% haven't done this on their own. They've systematically worked to buy up our government. Corporations spend hundreds of millions of dollars each year to influence politicians to serve their agenda, and those contributions have increased exponentially in the last 10 years. As a result, politicians in both parties, including both Republican and Democratic presidents, have responded by voting for free trade agreements, increased military expenditures, financial deregulation, cutting environmental safeguards, tax cuts for the wealthy, and cuts to our safety net. The final piece of the 1% strategy is divide and conquer. The 1% is going after many of the basic rights that we fought so hard for. The 1% has gone after programs like affirmative action, access to birth control, and gay marriage. The prison system keeps many African American people locked up and locked out of the economy, while immigrants are being denied basic human rights in states like Arizona and Alabama, where people without documentation are denied access to human needs like water services. The 1% is trying to set us against each other. They appeal to racism, sexism, and homophobia to keep us fighting each other. They say that immigrants are to blame for unemployment rates among native-born workers, to distract us from the fact that they are the ones eliminating good jobs. They set up false choices between good jobs and a clean environment, as though those are somehow at odds. They know that when we turn on each other, we don't have the power to challenge their hold on our economy and our democracy. What has been the result of these three strategies of attacking workers, taking over our democracy, and dividing us from each other? Rising inequality. Most income gains since 1979 have gone to the wealthiest 1% of the population. As a result, the share of our country's total income going to the top 1% is higher now than at any time since the 1920s. The distribution of wealth, as opposed to income, is even more lopsided. Just 1% of our population now owns 43% of the wealth in our country. And yet again, increasing inequality means increasing instability in our society. Well, this spring, that's changing. This year, we say enough. We need a new story for this country, and it's up to us to write the next chapter. That new story is already being written by the 99% who are fighting back, from union members in Wisconsin to immigrant workers in New York and Los Angeles, from students shutting down coal plants in their communities, to community organizations across the country who are calling on corporations to pay their fair share, from the Occupy movement to all of us here together today. This spring, we are going to do more than scrape and struggle to save what little we have left. We are coming together to demand a whole new economy. Are you ready?